On the Palatine at dawn, Rome seemed to hold its breath. Marble columns caught the first cold light, and lamps guttered in the long corridors of the Imperial palace. Outside, the city busied itself with market carts and bakers' fires. Inside, servants arranged cushions and perfumed incense. From the terraces one could see the Tiber ribboning through stone, and the far roar of a forum waking to business and rumor. Yet beneath this ordinary morning air, there was another rhythm, quieter and more terrible, an architecture of power that used beauty, ceremony, and order as instruments of control. This is the shadow the title names. Caligula's terrifying legacy was not only a string of outrages recorded by hostile biographers. It was also a system, careful, bureaucratic, and ritualized, that folded young women's lives into the machinery of imperial prestige. The phrase, "the virgins who suffered the ultimate fate," carries the weight of sensational headlines, but the reality is knotty and fragmentary. Some ancient writers allege deaths and suicides, others only hint at lifelong ruin. What remains clear in the surviving fragments and in the patterns those fragments form is a story of institutionalized humiliation and erasure. The palace could make a life invisible without ever shattering a bone in public. That is the cruelty that lasted. When Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by the nickname Caligula, came to power in 37 AD, the city greeted him with a mix of relief and expectation. Tiberius, his predecessor, had left a climate of fear and secrecy. The new emperor entered to triumphal crowds and elaborate gifts. Ancient sources, notably Suetonius and the loose orbit of senatorial memoirs and gossip, record the early hopes, a ruler who might restore the public face of Rome, who would re-engage in spectacle and generosity. For a time, there were gestures that suggested a less repressive tone, lavish games, public largesse, the easy posture of a young man adored. Yet those public gestures, banquets, triumphal processions, brilliant entertainments, served a second purpose. They were not merely theater for the masses. They were also the stage upon which the palace refined its mechanisms of control. Opulence, when administered by an absolutist, becomes a language that says, "This is not yours." The emperor's garden, his private banquets, the alcoves where music floated like fog, these were calibrated spaces in which power could be both visible and private. Luxury became a velvet trap. Ancient testimony to the specific institutions inside Caligula's household is thin and often moralizing. Still, fragments converge around a troublesome picture. A designated section of the imperial household, referred to in various accounts as a garden of Venus in chroniclers' imaginations, functioned as an apparatus for the selection and display of young women.
Whether that phrase is literal or a later commentator's shorthand for the palace's eroticized ritual is part of the historian's caution. What the sources consistently suggest is not merely random indulgence, but administrative practice. Lists were kept, names were recorded, officials operated with purpose. The system had rules and agents. Local magistrates and provincial officials could be summoned to propose candidates. Wealthy families might offer daughters to curry favor. Lower status girls might be taken without eloquent pretense. Criteria were not purely aesthetic, nor exclusively social. Youth and appearance mattered, certainly, but so did the quality of purity, as understood in Roman social terms, an index of unbroken family standing, a commodity convertible into honor or influence for the household that surrendered a girl. Records, wax tablets, shorthand lists, memoranda, reduced persons to entries, the place of origin, the age, the name, the note that this one was accepted, that one deferred. Bureaucracy did not make the suffering less real, it made it more durable, more transportable from one generation of courtiers to the next. Inside the palace, this cataloging took on ritual form. The public saw banquets in the laughter that adorned them. They did not see the back rooms where women waited between audiences, where their names were called and crossed off like commodities. The language of honor was turned inside out. To be brought to the imperial household was publicly, even legally, an honor. Privately, it could mean erasure. It is here that the word virgin multiplies in its ambiguity. To contemporaries, virgin could mean bodily state, family reputation, a status assigned and policed by kin and patria potestas, and a symbol to be used in public display. The palace retooled that symbol into a reputation management tool for the emperor and for those around him. But it was not only the emperor who wielded this system. Power was distributed. the Praetorian Guard, the household officers, freedmen with the emperor's ear, and members of the senatorial order all had roles that made harm possible and concealment plausible. A soldier's loyalty, a freedman's obedience, a senatorian's silence. These were the scaffolds that held the system upright. When state-sponsored prestige attaches itself to secrecy, social mechanisms automatically reward the colluders: favors, wealth, pardons, and avoidance of reputational cost. In such an arrangement, victims are seldom visible in official correspondence. Their lives are footnotes, or often erased. Amid this machinery, we meet Libya. She is a dramatized composite, drawn from the impossibly thin threads of fragmentary evidence, and shaped to let us imagine what surviving in that system could mean. She is neither representative of every woman brought to the palace, nor a claim that any one historical personhood existed with her exact details. She stands instead as an empathetic anchor, a window through which the human dimensions of organized humiliation become legible. Libya's family lived on the fringes of Rome's provincial class. Her father labored in public administration in a distant colonia, and her mother kept the household with the thrifty determination of women who understood the law of reciprocity in their world. At 14, an age mentioned in a few later testimonies as within the range of those presented, the family received a summons. Official language cloaked the request in honor, a chance to present their daughter to the imperial household, an opportunity that would bring prestige and possibly protection. The letter itself would have been brief, stamped with a signet, carried by a cleric whose inflection could not be read as anything other than command. To decline such an invitation was to court ruin. To accept could mean an opening to fortune or the beginning of disappearance. Her journey to the Palatine was a passage of changing textures. At first, there was the provincial sameness of dirt roads and vendor stalls, then the approach to Rome, with its brick and marble, the smell of the river, the sound of 100 languages compressed in one place. On the Palatine, the air changed. Cedars, stone warmed by the sun, the persistent scent of oil and incense. Servants took her cloak, smoothed the tunic that was white and new, a ceremonial whiteness that signaled a beginning. They braided her hair in the manner dictated by palace stylists, attached strings of glass beads that caught the light. She was given a place among other young women, some of whom had been with the household longer, others who, like her, had arrived with the tremor of expectation and fear. The first banquet she attended was an education in how power taught its lessons. Tables ran like islands in a sea of cushions, silver glinted, and musicians breathed bowed instruments into the night. There was a ritual to being presented: the emperor's approach, the curated line of faces, the declarative naming that turned person into symbol. The act of presentation extracted a girl from the world of family and reciprocity and made her public property in a performative sense. Name and identity were folded into the narrative of the emperor's magnanimity and taste. To be chosen was to be praised was to be displayed. The words of the feast, laughter, toasts, a witty insult, were the quicksilver that both dazzled and dissolved. She learned quickly the rules that were never written on tablets, but were inscribed in gestures and silences. Praise from the emperor could be followed by a coldness from those same courtiers who had applauded. A favored glance might become a rumor that spread faster than any recorded decree. Waiting became a constant exercise in uncertainty. One day a girl might be allowed to eat with other attendants in freedom. The next she might be summoned and returned to her dormitory with a new silence around her. Reward and punishment operated on the same scale. Both were forms of attention that produced an interior economy of hope and dread. In that economy, Libya found herself bargaining with invisible rules. She learned to measure her words, to tilt her head at the precise angle that signified humility without supplication. She learned that a refusal could be read as insolence, and that pleading could be construed as manipulation. The mechanisms of control we now call psychological, uncertainty, double-bind, isolation, were in the palace old tactics dressed in new finery. The emperor's household, like any tightly run institution, leveraged ambiguity to achieve obedience. If you never knew whether praise would follow silence or punishment, you learned to curtail initiative.
If your closest companion might be transferred overnight for reasons no one explained, attachment softened into guardedness. If favors always arrived through the same intermediaries who administered scolding, dependency hardened. These techniques are not inventions of modern psychology. They are practical enactments of power. Within the palace, they were amplified by architecture. Long corridors that muffled voices, courtyards that served as arenas of gaze, small rooms placed strategically so that no conversation could be assumed private. Surveillance was both routine and subtle. The praetorians were formal watchmen, their presence an explicit reminder of the state's interest in order. But surveillance extended beyond armed men. The domestic staff, the freedmen who oversaw lists, the stylists who memorized faces, the scribes who made entries on tablets, were eyes and pens. A wax tablet could preserve a note of approval. A scribal mark could consign a girl to reserve lists. The people who held the emperor's favor had incentives to police boundaries. They were rewarded for service, for maintaining the protocols that preserved the emperor's dignity. Conversely, those who resisted found themselves isolated by bureaucratic omissions, no invitations, no mention in the guest lists, a slow, effective erasure. Complicity was rarely dramatic. More often it arrived as a train of small, rationalized acts. A senator could look away because his own home comforts depended on the goodwill of the court. A praetorian could obey orders because obedience meant steady pay. A freedman could obey because discretion protected newly acquired status. Silence had a price, but it also had benefits. Silence was a currency of survival. The social code of Roman honor, rooted in family standing and public perception, made it difficult for victims to speak with crushing consequences. To accuse was to invite scandal upon one's kin. To remain silent was to let a reputation be reset by others.
The archival traces that survive, Suetonius's moralizing anecdotes, a smattering of later senatorial remarks, some legal commentaries, do not present a clean ledger. Historians proceed by triangulation, comparing narratives, assessing tone, and acknowledging where evidence thins. Suetonius, writing decades later, records stories that have the luster of rumor and the bite of moral judgment. Fragmentary testimonies from attendants and a few administrative notes hint at lists and programs, but resist neat reconstruction. Where the sources disagree, the script here prefers caution. It will not claim certainty where only inference exists. Yet even with those caveats, the outline is chilling enough. An imperial mechanism using ceremony to confine and silence. Libya's interior life, as we imagine it, became a study in small defeats. The first few nights, she dreamed of returning home, of her mother's hands smoothing the hem of a dress, of the creak of their small kitchen table. Morning brought a new ritual, a roll call in the dormitory where names were called and noted. Afternoon in enforced seclusion, while other girls practiced music in the garden. Evening, the public parade of faces for visitors from the provinces. Each day taught her how to be invisible in plain sight. The more she performed obedience, the more distinguished patrons at the feast interpreted her compliance as a mark of a worthy subject. Obedience and humiliation braided together until she could no longer easily separate them. This slow corrosion has a particular cruelty. It does not require violent spectacle to break a person. It uses the slower tools of dignity and doubt. Imagine the effect of being presented as an emblem at which powerful men joke. Imagine being reduced to a single attribute, purity, that may be rewarded one moment and used against you the next. Libya's self, like that of others, risked being replaced by the persona the palace required. Pale robe, still hands, eyes that register but do not answer. The loss was not only social, it was interior. She began to think in measures of risk, to weigh speech for its potential cost. Memory itself adopted that economy, folding difficult moments into a silence that saved her from immediate reprisal but undermined her later chances to testify.
At the edges of Libya's days, there were small acts of compassion, an old attendant who once left a fig behind, a fellow girl who whispered a joke in a rare private corridor, but these were exceptions that illuminated rather than softened the structure. Kindness in the palace had a tactical quality when exhibited by those with power. A favor could buy silence, a bowl of stew could implicate a patron. The very gestures we might read as humane were often currency. The palace's mechanisms extended beyond the emotional. They had a legal and cultural frame.
Roman social norms conferred the paterfamilias with authority over daughters and sons. The state's interventions often formalized family decisions into civic action. When a family offered a daughter to the household, the transaction existed in a gray zone between voluntary petition and coercion. Some families sought imperial favor as a strategy for survival, believing that proximity to the emperor could secure privileges. Others were pressured by officials who hinted that refusal would harm pensions, positions, or local standing. The law's voice was not always protective. Rather, it sometimes amplified existing hierarchies that incentivized compliance. It is tempting to imagine that the fall of such a system would be sudden, a dramatic rescue staged by insurgents, or a moral rebuke from the Senate. In reality, the machinery had deeper roots and more subtle supports. The palace's social network extended out into provinces, where men in power had learned that reputation could be leveraged. The market of favors made silence profitable across social strata. A conspirator might aim a dagger at an emperor's flesh, but the institution of silence required dismantling a wider web of interests. Within this context, Libya's private moments of reckoning were small, but no less decisive. Once, during a lull in the schedule, she found herself in a small chamber where a thin scholar of the household read aloud names from a parchment. He mispronounced one, and Libya, who prided herself already on courtesy and correct Latin, corrected him softly. The man blinked. That single correction, a minor infraction against the palace's etiquette for enforced deference, marked her in the reader's memory. He nodded and made a note, a faint ink dot beside her name. Days later, that dot translated into an altered schedule. She was called earlier than usual and ushered to a private audience. It was in the quiet of the antechamber, where the light came through a small, high window and dust motes floated like minute constellations, that the true mechanics of selection revealed themselves. The antechamber was a net. Servants moved like the edges of a web, catching everything that fluttered within. The praetorian, formal and bored, stood by the entrance. The emperor's freedman arrived with the list. Names were read. The reading itself was a ritualized form of power. Voices converted persons into instruments for use. A name announced could mean an overnight change of status. For Libya, the call was both a rupture and a confirmation of what she already suspected, that to be noticed was to be subsumed. We must pause here to acknowledge the line between source and reconstruction. The precise details of who stood where in that room are not preserved. What survives is the pattern: calls, lists, privileged channels, and the inscrutable power of being named. From these fragments, we reconstruct an interior logic that is plausible and consistent with Roman court practice, but where gaps remain, we mark our words as interpretive. The goal is not to produce a melodrama of individual cruelty, but to make sensible the mechanisms that made any cruelty possible. Being called to a private audience did not automatically mean death or a specific act. It meant several possible outcomes, all dangerous to a girl's previous life. Some girls returned to their families after a stint in the household, carrying gifts that softened talk in the village. Some disappeared from public view for months and reappeared with different names or a new silence. Still others, according to fragmentary reports that caution us rather than instruct us, suffered fatal consequences, whether directly or through the despair that followed their experience. Historians must handle those reports with humility. Suetonius reports stories, some later sources suggest, and modern scholars debate which accounts rest on fact and which are retrospective moralizing. Yet the existence of such reports is itself significant. Even rumors of ultimate destruction mark the weight of the system. On the day Libya was summoned, the world narrowed to sound and proximity. Doors closed softly behind her. The corridor's lamps threw thin light across mosaics, where mythic figures danced in tessellated stone. Their frozen gestures mocked the living girl's mobility. A servant unfastened the strings of her tunic with practiced fingers. A new robe was slipped over her shoulders, clean, ceremonial, unpersonal. She was led past a small garden where a discreet fountain bubbled like an indifferent chorus. The palace's choreography concealed its intent. Each movement cleaned away traces of daily life, until the only thing left was the ritual form the palace demanded. The audience itself was uneventful in outward drama. Words were few. Names, once again, did the work. The emperor's glance, mere appearance, acted as verdict.
we do not reconstruct the content of that glance as though it were an act. Rather, we understand it as one element in a broader system that judged, recorded, and decided. Libya returned to her dormitory with the same breathless stillness that had accompanied her arrival. She could not put the night's events into an ordered story. The palace's grammar forbade narrative. The silence that followed was as instructive as any instruction manual. When one studies institutions of secrecy and control, a pattern emerges. Systems favor the repetition of small, plausible acts that, strung together, produce catastrophic outcomes for individuals. In the palace, a name called at a certain hour, a redirecting note on a wax tablet, a single attending freedman who favored a girl, these were the unit operations of a larger program.
For Libya, as for many others, the accumulation of those units began to converge toward outcomes her family could not foresee, and that records would later struggle to capture. Outside, in the city's noisy churn, life continued. A senator paced his portico, a baker cried goods, a child chased a hoop in the dust. The contrast between the public pulse and private machinery of the palace is one of the most disquieting lessons of this history. Rome could admire the emperor's largesse in the morning and ignore the silencing of daughters by afternoon. The civic gaze, trained to think in spectacles and public accounts of prestige, often missed the private architectures that supported spectacle. That disjunction between the visible performance of power and the invisible systems that sustain it is where the palace's cruelty found its greatest success. As the weeks extended, Libya's life reconfigured itself around the palace's temporality. Days were punctuated by small humiliations and rare, bewildering rewards. She learned that a necklace left anonymously at her pillow could be as binding as any command, that a whisper from a favored attendant could be as constraining as a law. It was a world in which agency shrank to the size of gestures: what to say when a minister bowed, how to receive a cup, which side of a cushion to choose for sitting. Each small choice carried freight. Each small reward carried obligation. And yet, in that compressed life, memory also began to keep small resistances. Libya memorized the faces who had shown her any kindness. She kept the outline of an old woman's laugh in an inner pocket. She whispered names one time in the dark, so that the sound would exist beyond the palace's oral economy. Those secret acts, memorizing, whispering, naming, are in many cases how survival persisted. When public records erased a name, memory preserved it. It is at this juncture, after the mechanics are in motion and the human anchor has entered the heart of the palace, that the story begins to accumulate the tensions that will later snap into crisis. The institutional net tightens slowly, and human frailty and quiet courage coexist uneasily. The emperor's favor can be as ephemeral as a gust. A servant's note can change the axis of a life. In the coming months, the palace will continue to perform its rituals. The lists will swell and contract, and Libya's small acts of defiance will gain weight through repetition. The threads of complicity will become more visible, praetorians moving with a practiced indifference, senators trading looks that mean more than words, scribes who make and unmake records with a wrist. Even now, before the shock that will one day open palace doors and force histories to reckon, the system breathes like a beast that has learned to mask itself with finery. Its violence is administrative and aesthetic, diffuse and intimate. It is terrifying precisely because it makes suffering ordinary.
If you find this topic compelling, subscribe for more deep historical investigations. There are more layers to uncover, more testimonies to weigh, and more fragments that demand attention. We proceed then into the heart of the mechanism. How did the palace maintain its files? How were girls selected across the breadth of the empire? What incentives held the system stable? And how did ordinary Roman institutions, family law, patronage networks, and military loyalty participate in a structure that erased names? To answer those questions requires looking both outward at the city's entanglements and inward at the palace's routine operations. The wax tablets and scribes, the patrons and purveyors, the catalogs of favors, and the ledger-like lists, all of these must be examined not as abstractions, but as the literal implements of power. One of the clearest traces of administration in Roman domestic life is the wax tablet. They were cheap, portable, and malleable, ideal for the private, mutable records a household required. A scribe would inscribe a note, then smooth the wax to amend or erase as policy or favor demanded. In the imperial context, such tablets could serve as temporary registers, names written during a selection, marks for allocation, shorthand notes on dispositions. The fragility of such media matters. They were easily altered or destroyed. That ephemerality favored those who wished their decisions to remain off the public record. It also made the historical recovery of victims' names precarious. Coupled with tablets were the lists maintained by the palace stewards. These were not simple inventories of goods, they were social inventories. A list could indicate who had been presented and when. Another might show who had been granted a small annuity or a token gift for return to family. Such documents reveal the transactional dimension of honor in the Roman world. Gifts could grease private reputations, and hush money could recalibrate a family's willingness to protest. In many cases, families who received gifts or patronage were less likely to initiate formal complaints. The market of favors created an alignment of interests that favored silence. Provincial officials also played a role. Requests for candidates might cross provincial boundary lines. A governor or municipal magistrate could be asked to recommend faces reputed for purity or beauty. Their motivations varied. Some acted out of a genuine desire to secure advantage for their community. Others complied under the pressure of imperial order. The very language used, terms like offer, present, sent, blurred the line between voluntary dedication and coercive apprenticeship. In that linguistic haze, resistance found few footholds. In the palace, the household staff handled logistics with a mixture of bureaucracy and discretion.
Freedmen, often the palace's administrative backbone, kept the schedules, informed the wardens, and relayed the emperor's wishes in ways that made them indispensable. Their access granted them extraordinary power. A freedman who favored a girl could ensure she received attendance from particular attendants. One who bore the emperor's displeasure could consign a girl to forgettable service. The social assent of freedmen, tied to their capacity to enforce discretion, entrenched mechanisms of control that were less obvious to the public but undeniable to those within. At every level, the incentives to maintain the system were built into the social fabric. Silence protected reputations, patronage protected careers, complacency protected privilege. The palace's rituals of display were mirror images of a system that had learned to translate human lives into symbols and commodities. For the girls taken into that system, personhood became negotiable. Libya, in small ways, found systems of adaptation. She learned to map the palace by the sound of footsteps. She counted the nights between presentations as a measure of stability. She watched whom the emperor favored and had the rare, bitter clarity to see how quickly favor cooled. In one quiet moment, she discovered a loose wax tablet tucked behind a stone in the dormitory wall. An old, forgotten ledger, whose ink faded, but whose lines hinted at names that had been crossed off. She traced a finger over the indentations. The act of touching that record felt to her like an act of remembrance. It was not evidence that the public would accept in a court of law, but it was a piece of continuity that mattered more than any official ledger could. The palace's capacity to erase extended beyond records into memory. When a girl returned home with gifts and a new silence, the community often preferred to narrate her story in terms that restored honor or explained absence away. Families, under pressure, composed their narratives carefully. Sometimes they adopted the party line, some sea voyage, some distant marriage. In other cases, they invented plausible civic duties to explain a girl's months of absence. The state, in effect, became co-author of family's narrative in ways that benefited both. This collusion between public record and private story is one reason why so many voices were lost to history. Yet loss was never total. Memory, oral, tactile, stubborn, kept pieces alive. An old neighbor might maintain a child's nickname as proof that she existed beyond the palace's symbolic function. A servant's furtive remark could be the seed of a future testimony. These small repositories of truth would later matter when the edifice of power wavered. Documents that belonged to the palace could be destroyed, but a human voice could not be entirely erased if it had been remembered by another.
What emerges from this tangle is not a story of theatrical, tyrannical whim alone, but a sociological portrait of how absolute power becomes infrastructural. Systems of selection, presentation, and concealment are not the product of one personality. They are the habits of institutions maintained by many. Caligula's personal proclivities, however ancient chroniclers describe them, would have mattered, of course. So too did the administrative competence of those who turned desire into program. Power, when funneled through bureaucratic devices, becomes both more efficient and more insidious. For Libya, the palace was not a single event, but a prolonged grammar of constraints. She adapted her gestures to survive, yet adaptation does not equal consent. The difference between a shrug and resignation is not a historical triviality, it is the hinge on which human dignity spins. The palace could take away her public role as daughter or sister and replace it with a ceremonial one, but it could not and did not always claim the inner stores of memory and resistance that she guarded verbatim. As the weeks turned into seasons, a slow pressure mounted on the palace's edifice. Rumors, those ancient weather signals, moved through forums and taverns. Men who had once lauded Caligula in public began to speak in softer tones. Conspiracy, like a subterranean root, began to gather moisture. The palace's mechanisms remained intact, but fissures appeared at the edges where ambition, honor, and fear intersected. For Libya and others, the end of one order would not neatly translate into freedom. Systems become habit. Habits leave traces even when their originators vanish. We have traced the system into which Libya was drawn, the public adulation that masked private structure, the lists and tablets that reduced persons to entries, the small techniques of control that corroded interior life, and the social incentives that protected silence. The next stage of the story will carry us toward the point at which the system breaks, at least temporarily, an assassination that will open doors and expose in its chaos some of the palace's secrets. The moment of rupture will bring its own confusion, liberation for some, re-traumatization for others, incomplete justice for most. Until that rupture, however, the palace continued its quiet business of transforming people into symbols and then disposing of the evidence. In all of this, historians must remain attentive to the difference between what is recorded and what is plausible. Not every detail is preserved, not every name appears in ink, but the cumulative pattern matters. Systems leave traces. In the fragments, waxed lists, bitter anecdotes and later biographies, the occasional letter from a worried matron, one hears an echo of what institutional silence sounded like. Libya's story moves forward inside that echo.
Soon she will be confronted with choices that are not choices at all, and the palace's rhythms will accelerate in ways that will test not only her endurance, but the loyalties of those around her. The mechanisms of power will reveal themselves in acts both petty and consequential. The human cost will be measured not only in headline events, but in the slow attrition of voice and memory. It is to those next months, the complicities that harden, the small resistances that persist, the inscriptions of record and the erasures that follow, that we now turn. The break came like a sudden winter wind through a sealed hall. Quiet, then a movement of blades. On a morning as ordinary as any, the palace's rhythm splintered. Men who had learned to keep their faces smooth pulled knives from cloaks. Voices that had practiced discretion for years rose to a single terrible pitch. The assassination of Gaius, recorded in the annals and in rumor, was swift and intimate, an implosion within the rooms that had perfected concealment. Ancient accounts, written in varying tense of hostility and confusion, point to a handful of conspirators among the Imperial Guard and disgruntled officers, with Cassius Chaerea named repeatedly in later testimony as one who struck. Exactly who stood where and spoke which words cannot be fixed with certainty. The sources disagree on details and motive. What does emerge consistently is a sudden removal of the man who had given shape to the palace's rituals and the immediate loosening of the order he maintained. In the hours after the violence, the palace, built for ceremony and secrecy, became a theater of uncoordinated exits. Doors were flung open, servants stumbled into the sunlight, and the usual choreography dissolved. For the women of the household, the shift from tightly regulated routine to chaotic freedom was not a single, uncomplicated relief. Liberation arrived wrapped in thunder and uncertainty. Some heard the shouts and fled toward the outer gates with nothing but tunics on their shoulders. Others remained, paralyzed by shock, rooted to their places by the same obedience that had kept them invisible. Within a structure that had trained its occupants to measure danger as a constant, chaos could feel like a new and even more incomprehensible threat. Libya experienced the moment as a rupture in scale rather than character. She had learned over months to interpret the palace's small cues, the lull in music, the change in the steward's gait, and so she read the sudden movements with a practiced attention. When the first distant sound of fighting reached her, she did not immediately imagine escape. Instead, her mind catalogued microsigns: the absence of the usual attendant at the threshold, an unmade bed, a cloak left on a bench as if dropped in haste.
Her instinct, shaped by the palace's grammar, was to hide, to fold herself into the silence that had protected her in lesser crises.
Yet, the palace had been designed for performances, not for retreats, and those designs now opened routes out. Conspiratorial violence, by its nature, is uneven in effect. The conspirators who aimed at the emperor sought a political end, an end to a perceived tyranny, a retrieval of honor in the imaginations of their class. They did not plan liberation for the household's women. They had not made the suffering of those women the center of their designs. This is an important distinction. The violence that toppled the palace's executive head was not primarily a rescue mission. It was a political act, enacted by men who were motivated by injured honor, fear of humiliation, and ambition. For the girls within, the result was unpredictable: sudden freedom for some, deeper confusion for others, and for a few, perhaps, a change that would later prove lethal in ways not easy to trace. As the tumult continued, a kind of provisional power asserted itself. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalties had both protected and constrained the household, moved decisively. Historical fragments suggest that the Praetorians declared a new leader in the days after, installing Claudius at the command post in order to provide stability. Whether this was planned in the assassination's immediate aftermath or emerged as an improvisation, it mattered for the survivors. Claudius's accession, pragmatic, cautious, interested in restoring order, brought with it a political imperative: normalize and calm. For the members of the palace, that imperative often translated into an administrative project of smoothing over the scandal. The new regime had reasons to prefer a manageable transition to a prolonged public reckoning. The practical measures taken in the wake of the assassination were bureaucratic as much as political. Lists were made or reconstituted, names checked and rechecked, household accounts recorded new entries for gifts and pensions, officials were dispatched to provincial homes with sacks of coin and letters of explanation. The language used in those communications tended to emphasize stability and gratitude, phrases that suggested favor rather than exposure. Where protests had seemed possible, they were coaxed into silence by offers that restored a family's honor in a changed register: a stipend, a coveted office, a dowry that could be spoken of in polite company. In some cases, restitution functioned as an alternative to justice. The state, prioritizing order, preferred transactions that would reabsorb scandal into the normal economy of patronage. For survivors, these peace brokers offered both relief and erasure. A returned girl who arrived home with a generous gift was more likely to be reintegrated under terms that closed conversation. Families who accepted such offerings had material reasons to avoid public interrogation. Exposure might cost them the very gains that could secure their future.
The law, the social discipline of reputation, and the material substitution of hush money all converged to make speaking out hazardous. This was not necessarily a cynical conspiracy by every benefactor. Often it was a pragmatic decision by people who saw risk to their lineage in scandal. Yet the practical result was the same: the official record blurred, and the personal testimonies that might have made the palace's crimes incontrovertible were scattered. Thus, the palace's system of erasure, which had relied on ritual and bureaucracy to silence those within, found new ways to continue after the apex of power had been removed. The machinery had become partly independent of any single emperor. It had embedded itself in practices that responded to incentives. To dismantle such an apparatus required more than a dagger. It would have demanded sustained public exposure and legal restructuring, things the Roman state in that historical moment proved reluctant to invest. The state's priority was not necessarily the moral reckoning of private harm, but the stabilization of imperial authority. The immediate human aftermath, in its intimate detail, was disordered. Some girls returned to families and attempted to resume ordinary lives. For a few, the outward markers of their survival, jewelry, small pensions, marital arrangements, offered a plausible reintegration. Yet the internal terrain could be unmapped for decades. Libya returned to her provincial town with a favor received from a distant official, and the silence of the palace stitched into her every gesture. Her mother received coins and an official letter praising the family's loyalty. Neighbors congratulated the household on their renewed standing. The social script unfolded as if the girl had been temporarily absent on an honorable posting. But inside Libya, something had shifted irreparably. The scars of institutionalized control are often invisible and enduring. Where physical marks might heal, the mind's interior architecture bears the longer damage. Intrusive memories, dissociative pauses when a servant's footstep matches the pattern of a past summons, the tendency to measure conversation in degrees of risk.
Libya began to notice a narrowing of her horizons that no gift could remedy. She found the streets of her town strange, as if they belonged to strangers who moved with the unexamined confidence of those who had never had their names called. In bed at night she repeated, like a prayer, the faces of the few who had shown her kindness. These faces anchored her when worry swelled. She avoided childhood haunts that echoed with other people's expectations. The household's external gestures of reconciliation could not reconstruct the inner life that had been catalogued and rearranged by the palace. Other outcomes prove harder to map. Fragmentary reports and later rumors suggest a range of fates.
Some women, historians note with sorrow and caution, may have died in the years that followed. Some accounts indicate suicides or early deaths attributed to despair, though the sources are fragmentary and often morally charged. It is plausible that the cluster of social stressors, stigma, disrupted family relations, the weight of silence, contributed to premature deaths in certain communities. Yet historians must resist asserting individual causal chains where evidence is thin. The cumulative pattern, however, is clear enough. Many experienced long-term psychological harm and social marginalization. The phrase ultimate fate thus gathers different meanings: physical death in some accounts, emotional death in others, a social death in the form of expunged identity in yet more cases. The official posture towards such stories, then as now, tended to minimize. Claudius's administration, intent on stability, did not launch a sweeping investigation of the imperial household's prior practices. Instead, it prioritized the restitution of order. Senators who might have been complicit, or simply reluctant to open old wounds, preferred to keep court life inscrutable. The library of imperial informalities, from waxed lists to whispered agreements, remained largely within the reach of those who had the means and motive to protect it. Public inscriptions and monuments continued to narrate Rome as a civilization of grandeur, while private narratives were smoothed into acceptable forms of loyalty and gratitude. Still, some traces persisted. A handful of later writers recorded rumors that would not die. Surviving marginalia and references in senatorial speeches suggested unease. In isolated letters, a matron named Ennia, fictional as she is here, yet modeled on the kinds of correspondence that did survive in scattered epistles, wrote with a voice that combined shame, pragmatic bargaining, and the impulse to record. Ennia's letter, as preserved in the imagination of our sources, is not direct testimony of Libya's experience, but it serves as an index of how families managed exposure. She writes, in a compressed fragment we may reconstruct reasonably, a note of consolation to another mother, a description of the coins received, and a plea to keep the matter within trusted ears. Such documents, when they survive, show the social calculus that turned victims into negotiators for their own erasure. Memory, however, resists complete erasure. Oral whispers, nicknames kept alive by a neighbor, a child's recollection of the way a woman once laughed. These small sparks of testimony become seeds that can re-sprout into public recollection when conditions change. In later decades, as regimes shift and new generations ask different questions, fragments can coalesce. The historical record that survives to us tends to be a collage, moralizing biography, senatorial jokes, occasional legal notes, and the faint echo of oral tradition. The pattern of administrative behavior appears repeatedly enough to suggest institutional practice: lists and readings, patronage in exchange for silence, material restitution used to seal narratives. From these pieces, historians build an argument about systemic harm. There is an ethical argument bound up with this reconstruction. Recovering the voice of those silenced by institutions is not merely an antiquarian exercise. It is a moral duty that tests how we weigh fragmentary evidence against human cost. To say that a record is fragmentary is not to suggest we should therefore look elsewhere. Rather, it is to insist on a method that recognizes both the suffering and our limits in making it exact. Where the sources conflate rumor with report, where hostile biographers embellish and family letters circumscribe, the responsible historian marks uncertainty while insisting on the reality of structural harm. Libya's later life, as we may plausibly imagine it, reflects that tension between the material reconstitution of honor and the interior permanence of injury. She married, at her family's behest, a provincial man whose stability promised protection.
The marriage offered a respectable facade. It provided a household that could survive on received funds. In quiet moments, though, she found herself tracing the indentations left by the palace's wax tablets, the grooves where names had been written, the small places where memory had been literally impressed into wax and could be read by touch. These physical impressions, objects of material culture, became metaphors for psychological persistence. She kept one small fragment, a broken piece of a wax tablet, tucked away in the hem of a dressing cloth. It was a tiny relic of a period that the public narrative preferred to forget. When she pressed her thumb into the grooves, she felt an odd closeness to the people whose names had once been etched and then erased. Across years, the presence of such objects helped sustain a hidden archive. A midwife might recall a child's birth that did not align with a family's story. An old attendant might drop a name before correcting herself and locking eyes with someone who had been present. These slips were thin, almost nothing on their own. Yet collected over time, they formed a lattice of truth that later researchers could trace. Memory, preserved in objects and in the mouths of ordinary people, becomes resistance. There is also the matter of cultural frameworks. Roman conceptions of honor, family, and legal authority shaped the strategies victims and their families used to survive. The paterfamilias structure in particular placed authority in a public head of household who might prioritize the family's reputation over an individual daughter's testimony. That cultural logic made speaking out doubly dangerous. It threatened the immediate well-being of a woman by suggesting scandal, and it threatened wider kinship ties by publicly accusing powerful patrons.
To interpret these dynamics as purely moral failure on the part of the family would be to misread the structural constraints they faced. Instead, the social environment must be read as producing choices that were often survival strategies rather than statements of complicity. Another long-term effect of the palace's program was the normalization of certain practices across elite strata. When silence yields material reward, it becomes a technique worth imitating. Patrons in provincial towns learned to equate quiet acceptance with stability. Local elites, who had their own networks to maintain, practiced discretion as a civic virtue. This diffusion of habits meant that institutionalized silence did not crumble with the death of one emperor. It migrated into other social contexts and, for a time, remained resilient. The assassination that terminated the life that had centralized a system did not necessarily dismantle the network that had sustained it. Yet history does not end at routinized silence. Over generations, new actors question old arrangements. Later emperors, changing mores, and different social pressures can reopen closed conversations. The process of recovery is rarely linear. Testimony may surface decades later, often in the language of moral reflection or political critique. Classical authors, writing for different audiences and under varied regimes, preserved fragments that would later encourage historians to look more closely. Modern scholars, trained to read absence as carefully as present, can assemble an account that recognizes both the limits of evidence and the durability of institutional patterns. When we turn from past to present, the parallels are painful but illuminating. Institutions today, universities, religious bodies, corporations, sometimes hide harm behind prestige and procedural silence. The tools differ in detail, but the dynamics resemble one another: incentives for silence, rewards for complicity, and material substitutions that close rather than open inquiries. Drawing a direct equivalence across epochs is neither prudent nor honest. Cultural and legal frameworks vary dramatically. Yet the mechanisms, privilege combined with secrecy, the conversion of reputation into a shield, and the fracturing effect on victims' lives repeat in ways that demand vigilance. Remembering the past is not an exercise in accusation alone. It is an invitation to inspect the present for the same subtle architectures of protection. The ethical imperative that closes this portrait is therefore not merely historical curiosity. It is an insistence that memory matters, that the fragments we do possess must be tended and shared. Preserving small tokens, recounting modest testimonies, and refusing the seductive simplification of grand narratives are acts that honor those who were made silent.
Memory as resistance operates precisely through these small acts: naming where names have been erased, cataloging where records have been smoothed, listening where listening had been forbidden. What then became of Libya? The historical record cannot tell. It can tell us, however, that many women returned to a life that continued to bear the palace's imprint, material advantages exchanged for a silence that reshaped futures. Some accounts suggest that a few never survived the aftermath in a bodily sense. Others suggest early deaths or lives lived on the margins. For Libya, the most plausible arc is one of outward restoration and interior fracture. A marriage arranged in the interests of social stability, a household that respected her publicly, and nights in which she pressed her thumb to a wax fragment and spoke a friend's name into the dark. Such a life is not a melodramatic conclusion, but a testimony to the ways institutions can persist in the inward, quietly. The last image we will carry is a small one, a box of clay and wax kept behind a servant's trunk in a provincial home, found generations later by a child who could read and recognized the name. Inside was a folded scrap of letter and a brittle sliver of a wax tablet bearing a partial indent, a name press-cut and then smoothed over as if by haste. The name was incomplete, a handful of letters halved by time, yet that slit of lettering which the world once tried to erase survived in the simplest form of material continuity. It became a whisper across centuries, a point of contact between a human life and the long memory of a people. Caligula's parifying legacy, then, is not merely the headline of a scandal. It is a lesson about systems. It is the recognition that institutional cruelty can be slow, bureaucratic, and oddly efficient, not only through spectacular acts, but through the ordinary operations of lists, favors, and silence. It is the knowledge that when a society chooses stability over inquiry, the cost is often paid most dearly by those whose voices are least heard. And it is the reminder that memory, even in fragments, offers a modality of resistance, quiet, humble, and persistent. If this account has unsettled or moved you, share it to help keep these silent voices visible. Consult the description below for a brief list of sources and a note on dramatization. Some scenes are reconstructed where the record is thin, and those moments are offered as plausible interpretations grounded in the available fragments. The past's fragments demand our care. To remember responsibly is to listen, to preserve, and to refuse the ease of forgetting.